Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest. It was a balmy Wednesday evening, the kind that wraps you in a sultry embrace, the air heavy with the scent of blooming magnolias drifting through my open balcony doors. I stood in my loft apartment, the city skyline glittering like a constellation of stars beyond the glass, the faint hum of traffic a distant lullaby. At 42, I'd grown accustomed to my own company, the solitude a familiar companion since my daughter moved across the country for college 2 years ago. My evenings were usually a quiet affair, a glass of rosé, the soft glow of a lamp, and the pages of a novel to lose myself in. But that night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, a sharp knock at my door shattered the stillness, sending a jolt of curiosity through me. I wasn't expecting anyone. My fingers tightened around the stem of my wine glass, the cool glass grounding me as I crossed the room, my bare feet silent against the polished hardwood. Peering through the peephole, my breath caught in my throat. It was him, Nathan, the enigmatic man who lived in the penthouse above me. We'd never been close, our interactions limited to fleeting smiles in the elevator or a polite nod in the lobby. He was in his late 40s with a quiet intensity that always seemed to linger in the air around him. Dark hair streaked with silver, a chiseled jaw, and deep green eyes that held a story I'd never dared to ask about. But tonight, there was something different about him, a restless energy that made my pulse quicken as I opened the door. "Nathan," I said, my voice tinged with surprise, my fingers brushing against the silk of my emerald robe, the fabric slipping slightly off one shoulder as I leaned against the doorframe. He held a small, elegant box in his hands, wrapped in midnight blue paper with a silver ribbon that shimmered in the hallway light. "Hey, Vivian," he said, his voice a low, velvety murmur that sent a shiver down my spine. His gaze flickered over me, a fleeting heat in his eyes that made my skin tingle. "I hope I'm not interrupting." I shook my head, though my heart was racing, a mix of curiosity and something deeper stirring within me. "Not at all," I replied, my voice softer than I intended, a flush creeping up my neck. "What's this?" "A little something for you," he said, his expression unreadable, though there was a spark in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made my breath hitch. "I thought you might like it." "A gift from my upstairs neighbor?" I hesitated, my fingers brushing against the box as I took it from him, the paper smooth and cool beneath my touch. "That's unexpected," I said, my voice trembling slightly, my gaze lifting to meet his. "Why?" He let out a soft, husky chuckle, the sound wrapping around me like a warm breeze. "Just open it, Vivian," he said, his tone laced with a quiet insistence, a hint of something unspoken that made my stomach flutter. "You'll see." I glanced at him, my heart pounding, then gestured toward the living room, the city lights casting a golden glow across the space. "Would you like to come in for a drink?" I asked, my voice a little breathless, the invitation slipping out before I could stop it. He hesitated, his gaze lingering on me for a moment longer than necessary, a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. "Maybe another time," he said, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver through me. "Enjoy the gift, Vivian." Gah! And with that, he turned and disappeared down the hall, leaving me standing in the doorway, my skin flushed with a heat I couldn't ignore. Inside, I set the box on the glass coffee table, my fingers trembling as I stared at it, the silver ribbon glinting in the lamplight like a whispered promise. I slid the ribbon off, the paper falling away to reveal a sleek black box. Lifting the lid, I gasped, my breath catching in my throat. Nestled in a bed of crimson velvet was a delicate gold necklace, a tiny pendant in the shape of a rose dangling from the chain, its petals intricately carved, catching the light in a way that made it glow. But it wasn't just the necklace that made my heart race. It was the note tucked beneath it, the paper crisp and folded with care. I unfolded it with shaky fingers, my eyes scanning the words written in Nathan's elegant script. "Some secrets are meant to bloom in the dark. If you're curious, meet me at the rooftop bar tomorrow at 8 p.m. Nathan." A wave of emotion crashed over me. Curiosity, intrigue, and a simmering heat that I hadn't felt in years. I read the note again, each word unraveling a new layer of meaning, my fingers brushing against the rose pendant as I lifted the necklace from the box. This wasn't just a neighborly gesture. This was something more, something that made my skin tingle with anticipation. For the first time in a long time, I found myself wondering what I'd been missing, what secrets had been blooming in the shadows of my solitary life. I barely slept that night, Nathan's note a constant presence on my bedside table. The words illuminated by the soft glow of the moonlight streaming through my window. I must have read it a dozen times, each repetition igniting a new spark of curiosity, a restless energy that kept me tossing and turning. Was this just an invitation for a drink, or was there something deeper, something unspoken that had been simmering between us all this time? By morning, my mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, curiosity warring with hesitation, longing battling with fear. I went through my routine on autopilot, brewing coffee, answering emails, pretending that today was just another ordinary day. But the necklace around my neck told a different story. The rose pendant resting against my skin like a whispered secret, its weight both comforting and thrilling. By the time the clock neared 8 p.m., my resolve had solidified. I needed answers, needed to know what Nathan meant by his cryptic note, what secrets he wanted to share. I slipped into a fitted black dress that hugged my curves, the neckline dipping just enough to catch the eye, my dark hair falling in loose waves over my shoulders. The rooftop bar Nathan had mentioned was just a short elevator ride away, a sleek open-air lounge with panoramic views of the city, the kind of place where the air buzzed with possibility. I stepped out of the elevator, the warm night air kissing my skin, the city lights stretching out like a sea of stars below. And there he was, Nathan, seated at a corner table, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his navy blazer unbuttoned to reveal a crisp white shirt that clung to his broad chest. When he saw me, he stood, his green eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. "You came," he said, a slow, smoldering smile curving his lips, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down my spine. "I did," I replied, sliding into the seat across from him, my fingers brushing against the rose pendant as I met his gaze, a quiet challenge in my eyes. "Now tell me, Nathan, what's this all about?" For a moment, he didn't answer, his gaze roaming over me, a flicker of heat in his eyes that made my skin flush, my pulse racing. Then, with a quiet sigh, he leaned back, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass with a slow, deliberate motion that made my stomach flutter. "I suppose I should start from the beginning," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to wrap around me, pulling me closer despite my resistance. "Do you remember the woman who used to live in the apartment below you? The one who moved out last year?" I frowned, caught off guard by the question, a memory surfacing of an elderly woman with a warm smile, always tending to her potted plants on the balcony. "Mrs. Eleanor?" I asked, my voice soft, a pang of nostalgia tugging at my chest. He nodded, his gaze lowering for a moment, a shadow passing over his face. "She was my grandmother." The revelation hit me like a sudden gust of wind, my breath catching in my throat. "Your grandmother?" I whispered, my fingers tightening around the stem of my wine glass, the cool glass grounding me against the storm of emotions swirling inside me. He nodded, his voice softer now, a quiet vulnerability in his tone that made my heart ache. "She and my father were estranged for years, but I was close to her. After my father passed, she was the only family I had left. She always spoke so highly of you, Vivian, said you reminded her of herself when she was younger. Strong, independent, but with a fire she could see in your eyes." I blinked, stunned, my mind racing to process his words. I had no idea," I said, my voice trembling, a warmth spreading through me at the thought of Mrs. Eleanor's quiet affection. "She asked me to keep an eye on you," Nathan continued, his voice a low, intimate murmur that made my skin tingle. "Not in a way that would intrude, but just to be there if you ever needed someone. She knew you were alone, and she worried about you. But time passed, and I never found the right moment to reach out, until now." I glanced down at the necklace, the rose pendant catching the dim light of the bar, its petals glowing with a soft, golden warmth. "The rose," I murmured, my fingers brushing against the pendant, a quiet question in my voice. What does it mean? Nathan's lips curved into a wistful smile, a hint of something deeper in his expression, a smoldering intensity that made my breath hitch. It's a symbol, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate in my core. My grandmother used to say that everyone has secrets, feelings, desires, dreams, that they keep locked away, like a rose waiting to bloom in the dark. Sometimes all it takes is the right person to help you let it out. Something in my chest tightened, a wave of heat surging through me, my skin flushing with a warmth I couldn't ignore. This wasn't about a physical rose, it was about something deeper, something that made my pulse race, a quiet invitation that lingered in the air between us. "You've been watching over me all this time," I whispered, my voice trembling, my fingers brushing against the pendant as I met his gaze, a mix of vulnerability and longing in my eyes. Nathan's gaze softened, a quiet intensity in his green eyes that made my heart skip a beat. "I guess you could say that," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur that sent a shiver down my spine, a heat pooling in my core as his gaze lingered on me, a silent promise in his eyes. A warmth spread through me, unexpected but not unwelcome, a quiet longing that I hadn't let myself feel in years. For so long, I'd thought of myself as alone, navigating life with a quiet resilience, but maybe I hadn't been as alone as I'd believed. Maybe someone had been waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to let the rose bloom. I sat there, the weight of Nathan's words settling over me like a warm, intoxicating embrace, the city lights glittering below us like a sea of possibilities. All these years, I'd assumed I was moving through life on my own, building walls to protect myself, to keep the world at a distance. But here was this man, someone I'd only known in passing, someone I'd never truly let into my world, revealing that he'd been quietly watching over me, not out of duty, but out of something deeper, something that made my skin tingle with anticipation. I curled my fingers around the rose pendant, the cool metal a grounding contrast to the heat surging through me, my breath coming a little faster as I looked at him. "Your grandmother never told me any of this," I said finally, my voice softer than before, a quiet vulnerability in my tone that made my chest ache. Nathan took a slow sip of his whiskey, his gaze never leaving mine, a flicker of heat in his eyes that made my pulse race. "She didn't want you to feel watched," he said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to caress my name. "She always said you were strong, that you carried yourself with a quiet fire. But she also knew that even the strongest people need someone to see them, to remind them they're not alone." I let his words sink in, a warmth stirring in my chest, a quiet longing that I hadn't let myself feel in years. "You know," I said, forcing a small, teasing smile, my fingers brushing against the pendant as I met his gaze. "Most people would have just knocked on my door and said, 'Hey, I'm your neighbor. Let's grab a coffee.'" Nathan chuckled, the sound a low, husky rumble that sent a shiver through me, his eyes crinkling at the corners, a smoldering warmth in his gaze that made my skin flush. "Yeah, well," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur that made my breath hitch. "I wanted it to mean something when I finally reached out." There was a pause, a charged silence passing between us, a quiet understanding that made my heart race, a heat pooling in my core as his gaze lingered on me, a silent invitation that I couldn't ignore. "So what now?" I asked, my voice softer now, a quiet challenge in my eyes as I leaned forward slightly, the neckline of my dress dipping just enough to catch his eye. Nathan's expression grew thoughtful, a smoldering intensity in his gaze that made my pulse quicken, a quiet longing that mirrored my own. "That depends on you, Vivian," he said, his voice a low, velvety murmur that seemed to wrap around me, pulling me closer despite my resistance. "This wasn't just about giving you a gift or telling you about my grandmother. I wanted you to know that if you ever feel like letting that rose bloom, I'd be here to see it." I felt my breath hitch, a wave of heat surging through me, my skin flushing with a warmth I couldn't ignore. Was this a confession, an invitation, or simply an offer of companionship? Maybe it was all three, a quiet promise that sent a shiver through me, not of fear, but of possibility. For years, I'd convinced myself that my world was already set, that my story had been written, the pages of my life filled with solitude and quiet resilience. But maybe there were still chapters waiting to be discovered, secrets waiting to bloom in the dark. I looked at Nathan, really looked at him. The quiet confidence in his gaze, the warmth in his expression, the smoldering intensity that made my heart race. He wasn't a stranger, not really. He'd been there all along, lingering on the edges of my life, waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to let him in. Maybe it was time. Maybe I was ready. I reached for my glass, taking a slow sip of wine, the cool liquid a contrast to the heat surging through me, my gaze never leaving his. "Tell me, Nathan," I said, my lips curving into a small, teasing smile, a quiet challenge in my voice as I leaned forward, the rose pendant catching the light, a whispered promise against my skin. "How do you feel about taking a walk with me under the stars?" The warmth in his eyes deepened, a smoldering intensity that made my breath catch, a quiet longing that mirrored my own. "I'd like that," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur that sent a shiver through me, a heat pooling in my core as he stood, offering me his hand. The night air was warm as Nathan and I stepped out onto the rooftop, the city stretching out below us like a sea of stars, the soft hum of the bar fading into the background as we walked toward the edge, the skyline glittering with possibility. We stood in comfortable silence at first, the sound of our breaths mingling with the distant hum of the city, the rose pendant a quiet weight against my skin, a whispered promise of something new. It was strange how a single moment, a single gift, could unravel years of solitude, could make me question everything I thought I knew about my own life. "You seem deep in thought," Nathan said, glancing over at me, his voice a low, intimate murmur that made my skin tingle, a quiet warmth in his gaze that made my heart race. I smiled slightly, my fingers brushing against the pendant as I met his gaze, a quiet vulnerability in my eyes. "I guess I am," I admitted, my voice soft, a quiet longing in my tone that made my chest ache. He waited, giving me space to find my words, a quiet patience that made me feel seen, a warmth that I hadn't felt in years. "I've spent a long time convincing myself that I didn't need anyone," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly, a quiet confession that made my heart race, that it was easier to be alone, to rely on myself. And for a while, I thought that made me strong, but now, I wonder if I was just afraid of letting someone in. Nathan didn't answer right away, letting my words linger in the air, respecting their weight, a quiet understanding passing between us. "I get that," he said finally, his voice a low, husky murmur that sent a shiver through me, a smoldering warmth in his gaze that made my skin flush. "Sometimes we build walls so high we forget why we put them up in the first place." I turned to him, studying the quiet sincerity in his face, the smoldering intensity in his green eyes, a quiet longing that mirrored my own. "What about you?" I asked, my voice softer now, a quiet challenge in my tone as I stepped closer, the space between us charged with a heat I couldn't ignore. "Have you always been this patient, this thoughtful?" A small, husky chuckle escaped him, the sound a low rumble that made my pulse quicken, a smoldering warmth in his gaze that made my breath hitch. "Not always," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur that seemed to caress my name, a quiet longing in his tone that made my heart race. "I think life has a way of teaching us patience, whether we want to learn it or not." We stood there for a moment, the city lights glittering below us, the warm night air wrapping around us like a sultry embrace, a quiet understanding passing between us. "So what happens now?" I asked, my voice softer now, a quiet vulnerability in my tone as I met his gaze, a smoldering intensity in my eyes that mirrored his own. Nathan stepped closer, the space between us shrinking, a quiet heat in his gaze that made my breath catch, a smoldering longing that sent a shiver through me. "That's up to you, Vivian," he said, his voice a low, velvety murmur that seemed to wrap around me, pulling me closer despite my resistance. "But if you're willing, I'd like to find out. Together." I exhaled, a strange sense of relief washing over me, a quiet longing that I hadn't let myself feel in years. That sounds good, I said, my voice soft, a quiet smile curving my lips as I met his gaze, a smoldering warmth in my eyes that mirrored his own. For a while, we just stood there, the city stretching out below us, the lights reflecting in the distance like a sea of possibilities, a quiet warmth settling between us. I watched the skyline, the way it shimmered with endless potential, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like my own life could be the same. A rose blooming in the dark, a secret waiting to be discovered. A door had opened, and this time I wasn't afraid to step through it. Nathan by my side, a quiet promise of something new, something beautiful, waiting to bloom.